If you ever want to understand how fast power turns petty, watch what they do over $50. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and I learned that lesson standing in my kitchen at 6:12 a.m., staring at a single white envelope that felt heavier than it had any right to be. The paper was crisp, official, stamped with the Willowbrook Estates HOA seal, and it carried a message that didn't match its size: $50 owed, immediate payment required, or a lien would be placed on my home. The air in the room smelled faintly of last night's coffee and cold metal from the sink where I'd left a wrench after fixing a leaking faucet. Outside, sprinklers hissed in perfect synchronized patterns across identical lawns, like the whole neighborhood was breathing in unison. I didn't even hear her approach, but I felt her presence before I saw her. Patricia Holloway, HOA president, stood at the edge of my driveway in a pressed blazer and that calm expression people wear when they think the system always agrees with them. "Just standard enforcement," she said, her voice smooth, rehearsed, final. $50 keeps things fair." She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at my house like it was already measured in penalties. What she didn't know was that I had already paid it. Not because I agreed, but because I was curious how far something so small could be pushed. 3 days earlier, a bank processing delay had held the transfer. A minor issue, nothing more than a line of code and timing. But in Willowbrook Estates, timing was everything. I watched her that morning as she walked away, her heels clicking softly against the pavement, confident that control had already been established. The envelope had been her first move, but not her last. By noon, another notice arrived, this time threatening a lien filing and additional administrative fees. By evening, neighbors had started noticing the tone of things changing, the way emails from the HOA began to circulate with sharper language, tighter deadlines, more certainty. I sat at my desk that night, the glow of my laptop reflecting off the window, and reviewed every clause of their payment policy. That's when I saw it. Hidden. In plain text, almost too simple to matter, was a requirement that all accepted payments must be in legal tender if presented in person at a scheduled board session. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a garage door closing somewhere down the street. Patricia thought this was about compliance. She thought I was another name on a spreadsheet. But spreadsheets don't anticipate timing, and rules don't always account for scale. I printed the notice, folded it once, and placed it on the counter next to something else I had been quietly assembling over the past 2 days. It wasn't anger that guided me, and it wasn't impulse. It was structure. Because if they wanted $50 in the most controlled way possible, I was going to give it to them in the only form they could not quietly ignore. And tomorrow night, at the board meeting, they would learn exactly what that meant. The following morning did not feel different at first glance, but I could tell the neighborhood had already started to shift in subtle ways. Willowbrook Estates always had a way of pretending nothing was happening until it already had. The lawns were still perfectly cut, the sprinklers still traced their timed arcs across identical front yards, and the same faint smell of fresh mulch hung in the air like a routine that never questioned itself. But behind that calm surface, messages travel quickly in places like this. By the time I stepped out onto my porch, I had already received 2 notifications from the HOA portal, both referencing the pending $50 balance with increasing urgency and an added administrative fee that had not existed the day before. Patricia Holloway was not waiting for patience. She was accelerating structure. I remember standing there for a moment with my coffee untouched, watching a maintenance truck roll slowly down the street, its tires crunching lightly over gravel that had been replaced twice in the last year as part of what the HOA called community consistency upgrades. Everything in this place was controlled in increments small enough to feel harmless until they were not. At exactly 9:47 a.m., I received the confirmation that the matter would be escalated at the evening board meeting if payment was not received in acceptable form. The wording was precise, almost polite, but it carried the confidence of something that had done this before. I set the phone down and looked at the kitchen counter where everything I needed was already arranged. It was not complicated, just deliberate. The printed notice, and something much heavier in meaning and in weight. I had spent the previous evening reviewing the bylaws again, not because I doubted what I had already found, but because I wanted to understand how far they believed control extended. There is a difference between authority written and authority assumed, and Willowbrook Estates had built its entire structure on the space between the two. By midday, I noticed Patricia's car parked near the community entrance, angled slightly toward the main street as if she wanted to be seen without appearing to wait. She was speaking with 2 board members when I passed, her tone calm but clipped, the kind of voice that does not invite disagreement. I did not stop. I simply acknowledged the situation the way you acknowledge weather that is already forming but has not yet arrived. Inside my garage, I checked the contents of a simple container that had taken shape over the last 2 days. It was not elaborate, just intentional. The kind of preparation that does not announce itself. I could hear a lawn mower in the distance, steady and rhythmic, cutting through a yard that had likely been measured twice already this week. Everything here was measured. That was the point. At 4:30 p.m., I changed into a plain shirt and carried the heavy metal container by my side. The weight of it was significant, and the meaning was even more so. As I walked toward the board meeting location, I passed neighbors who were beginning to gather in small clusters, their conversations lowering slightly as I moved by. There is a particular silence that forms in communities like this when people are not sure whether to observe or participate. The building itself was the same as always, a low community hall with neutral walls and too many notices posted on a corkboard that no one fully read anymore. Patricia was already inside when I arrived, standing near the front table with the same composed expression I had seen before, the kind that assumes compliance is simply a matter of time. She glanced at me briefly, then away, as if the matter had already been resolved and my presence was just a formality. I took a seat near the middle of the room, placed the heavy container securely on the floor by my feet, and waited as the final attendees settled in. The air inside felt slightly too warm, the kind of controlled discomfort meant to encourage resolution rather than resistance. Patricia called the meeting to order at exactly 6 p.m., her voice carrying the same confidence it always did, outlining the agenda with practiced ease. When she reached my name, there was a faint pause, almost imperceptible, before she continued, framing the situation as a simple enforcement matter. $50, she said, as if repeating it made it smaller. I leaned back slightly, listening to the sound of pens shifting and chairs adjusting, and I realized something important in that moment. They believed this was already decided. And that belief was the only advantage I needed. The room was already settled into a kind of controlled anticipation when I felt the first shift in tone. It is strange how quickly authority in a place like this reveals itself not through words, but through silence. Patricia Holloway stood at the front table with her hands resting lightly on a stack of printed agendas, her posture perfect in the way people stand when they believe every outcome has already been accounted for. Around her, the board members adjusted their seats, exchanged brief glances, and then looked forward again as if rehearsed. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning above us, steady and indifferent, pushing cold air into a room that felt increasingly less neutral. Patricia began by summarizing routine items, maintenance schedules, minor landscaping approvals, and budget adjustments that sounded harmless until you realized how many layers of obligation they created. Her voice never rose, never rushed, never hesitated. When she finally reached my case, she paused just long enough to signal importance, then placed the printed notice on the table as if it carried legal finality in its physical weight. $50, she said again, slower this time, as though repetition could compress meaning into something unchallengeable. A few heads in the room turned toward me, then away. That was how it always worked here. Attention without involvement. Observation without responsibility. I could feel the folded notice still in my jacket pocket, the paper aligned carefully, as if structure alone could contain what it represented. Patricia continued explaining the escalation process, lien procedures, and administrative consequences, her tone suggesting this was not a discussion but a confirmation. She did not look at me directly. She did not need to. People like Patricia do not measure resistance by words. They measure it by silence. When she finished, there was a brief pause, and I noticed one of the board members shift in his chair, glancing at the door as if expecting something to resolve the moment for him. I stood slowly, not dramatically, not abruptly, just enough to register presence. The room did not react immediately, but I felt the change in air pressure that comes when expectation breaks alignment. I lifted the heavy metal box onto the table in front of me. It landed with a loud, solid thud, and I slid it forward with a motion that was almost ordinary. Patricia's eyes followed it for the first time that evening. It was not curiosity yet, more like calculation. She reached for it, assuming formality, and opened the latch with the same efficiency she applied to everything else. Inside was not resistance, not argument, not refusal. It was payment, structured exactly as required, down to the smallest detail they believed could not be challenged. I watched her expression hold steady for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. Around the room, I could hear the subtle sounds of chairs shifting again, the quiet friction of attention recentering. Patricia did not speak immediately. She looked down at the contents again, then at the board members beside her, then back at me. The certainty that had filled the room moments earlier began to lose its shape, not through confrontation, but through precision. I stayed still, letting the silence expand just enough to be noticed. Because what they had prepared for was defiance. What they had not prepared for was compliance delivered in a form they could not process quickly enough to control. For a moment after I placed the heavy box on the table, the room did not move. It was as if everyone was waiting for the object itself to explain what it meant. Patricia Holloway kept her hand resting near it, not opening it fully yet, studying it with the kind of controlled patience that comes from believing every outcome is already predictable. Then she finally lifted the lid. I watched her eyes scan the contents once, then again, slower this time. The expression on her face did not change immediately, but something behind her gaze did. The container did not contain a check, not a digital receipt, not a bank transfer confirmation. Inside was structured legal tender in physical form, exactly as required by their own written policy, carefully prepared and intentionally undeniable. 5,000 United States pennies, unrolled, unbundled, unconverted, each one representing the exact amount of the alleged debt multiplied into something they could not quietly process through assumption. A faint murmur moved through the room as Patricia tilted the container slightly, as if checking whether she had misunderstood what she was seeing. She had not. The board members leaned forward, confusion spreading in small, controlled reactions, the kind that people try to hide when they realize the system they trust is being followed too precisely. Patricia looked up at me for the first time with something closer to calculation than confidence. "This is not acceptable processing form," she said, her voice still steady but less rehearsed than before. I did not respond immediately. I simply nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a procedural detail rather than a confrontation. That was when I pointed to the printed policy binder sitting at the edge of the table, the same document they had distributed at the start of the fiscal year and required all homeowners to acknowledge. There was a clause, buried in Section 8, subsection 4, stating that any in-person settlement presented at a board session must be accepted as legal tender if it met the exact nominal value without deviation. No reference to convenience. No exception for format efficiency. Patricia turned the page in her own copy, scanning quickly now, her finger moving line by line with increasing urgency. The room began to feel different, not louder, but heavier, as if attention itself had become concentrated. One of the board members cleared his throat and asked quietly if the counting would need to be verified. That question changed the atmosphere more than anything else so far. Patricia closed the lid halfway, then reopened it, as if the action itself might alter what was inside. "This will require processing time," she said, attempting to reassert structure. I replied calmly that time had been accounted for. I had included the standard banking equivalency rate for physical currency handling as defined in their own financial addendum. That was when I saw the first real fracture in their control. Not anger, not confrontation, but the realization that every mechanism they used to enforce speed and pressure could also be reversed into delay. The pennies were not symbolic to them anymore. They were workload. They were accounting. They were verification. They were hours. Patricia looked around the room, clearly recalculating authority through logistics rather than law. The board members avoided her eyes now, not because they disagreed, but because they were beginning to understand that agreement would require labor. I remained seated, hands folded, observing the shift as it spread quietly across the table. Nothing had been raised, nothing had been threatened, nothing had been broken. Yet the structure they relied on was no longer moving at the speed they expected. And in that delay, something else began to form, something they had not prepared for, because it did not look like defiance at all. It looked like procedure followed too perfectly to ignore. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt structured, like something had been put into place that could not be easily removed. I remained seated, hands still folded, watching as Patricia Holloway tried to regain control of a situation that no longer responded to her usual pace. She closed the metal container fully this time, then set it down with a measured motion that was meant to signal authority, but it landed with the opposite effect. The board members around her were no longer looking at me. They were looking at the box, at the sheer physical reality of it, as if the form itself had become more important than the decision it represented. Patricia cleared her throat and attempted to reframe the moment as a procedural anomaly. She stated that the payment method would require review, that the format did not align with standard processing expectations, and that the matter would be tabled for administrative clarification. But the words carried less weight now, because everyone in the room had already seen the clause. The policy was not ambiguous. It was just inconvenient. That is when I noticed the first real fracture in the rhythm of the room. One of the board members quietly opened his own copy of the bylaws again, flipping directly to the section I had referenced earlier. Another leaned slightly forward, whispering something about verification protocols and handling procedures. It was no longer a discussion about whether the payment was valid. It was about what it would cost to process it. Patricia looked at them, then back at me, and I could see the recalculation happening behind her eyes. This was no longer about a $50 fee. It was about time, labor, and visibility. Every penny inside that box represented manual verification, physical counting, and administrative reporting that could not be compressed into a simple ledger entry. The system she had relied on for speed was now being forced into physical reality. I did not move. I did not speak. That was important. Because silence, when structured correctly, does not appear as resistance. It appears as confidence. Patricia finally opened the lid again, this time more carefully, as if the contents might have changed since she last looked. She lifted a handful of the unrolled coins and let them fall back into the container, listening to the sharp metallic sound as it confirmed what she already knew but did not want to acknowledge. Around the room, someone asked if the association had the capacity to process non-standard tender at scale. The question was innocent, but it shifted the energy again. Capacity was not something Patricia had accounted for in her enforcement strategy. She had built control through escalation, not absorption. Now escalation had turned inward. The board members began discussing logistics in low voices, mentioning bank drop-off limits, counting procedures, reconciliation hours, and security handling requirements. Each phrase added weight to the same realization. This was not a fine anymore. It was a workload event. Patricia attempted one more assertion of control, stating that acceptance of payment did not equal closure of the violation, but even she seemed aware that the statement no longer landed with certainty. The room was no longer aligned with her framing. It was aligning with process instead. I finally looked at her directly, not with challenge, but with calm acknowledgement, as if reminding her that everything happening now was already written in their own documents. That was when I saw it. The moment she understood that nothing about this could be dismissed without consequence, because every possible response required more effort than compliance. The system she had used to pressure others was now measuring her instead. And for the first time since I walked into that room, Patricia Holloway did not speak immediately. The room had shifted into a different kind of tension now, one that was no longer driven by authority but by hesitation. Patricia Holloway stood at the front table without speaking for several seconds, her eyes moving between the box, the board members, and the printed bylaws open on the table in front of her. I could hear the faint sound of a pen tapping somewhere near the back of the room, irregular and uncertain, like someone trying to maintain control over their own nerves. When she finally spoke, her voice was still composed, but the rhythm had changed. It was slower, more deliberate, as if each sentence now required internal verification before being released. She stated that the association would need to confirm processing procedures with the financial administrator, and that until confirmation was complete, the matter would remain technically unresolved. But even as she spoke, it was clear that the language no longer carried authority. It carried delay. The distinction mattered more than anyone in that room wanted to admit. I watched as one of the board members leaned toward another and quietly mentioned the cost of manual reconciliation for 5,000 individual units. The number itself was not large, but the implication was. It was labor multiplied by repetition, and repetition was something systems like theirs were not designed to absorb gracefully. Patricia turned slightly, instructing the secretary to log the payment as received but unprocessed, and I could see the attempt to reclaim structure through terminology alone. But terminology does not resolve friction. It only labels it. The container remained on the table, now partially opened, the contents visibly unchanged but functionally transformed in the perception of everyone present. It was no longer a payment. It was a process. I remained seated, observing without interruption, because interruption was no longer necessary. The mechanism had already been engaged. Patricia attempted once more to redirect the conversation back to enforcement policy, stating that compliance timelines still applied and that administrative review did not suspend violation status. But the words landed differently now, because everyone had begun calculating downstream effects instead of immediate authority. Someone asked quietly whether the association had precedent for bulk physical currency handling. Another voice followed, mentioning insurance reporting thresholds and accounting verification standards. Each question pulled the situation further away from control and closer to procedure. Patricia responded, but her answers were no longer anchored in certainty. They were anchored in necessity. There is a difference between enforcing rules and managing consequences, and the room had begun to cross that line without anyone explicitly acknowledging it. I noticed her glance toward the corner of the room where the association's financial binder was kept, as if searching for language that would restore equilibrium. But equilibrium requires symmetry, and symmetry had already been disrupted by the scale of what was sitting on the table. The pennies were not the issue. The issue was that every system they relied on now required manual engagement. The speed they depended on had been replaced with physical verification. The simplicity they assumed had turned into time allocation. Patricia finally closed the bylaws binder, not with force, but with recognition that it was no longer providing immediate answers. The sound of it closing was soft, but it felt significant in the silence that followed. I could see the board members begin to shift in their seats, not in disagreement, but in recalculation. They were no longer evaluating compliance. They were evaluating impact. And impact, unlike enforcement, does not stay contained within a single decision. It spreads into schedules, processes, and responsibility chains. Patricia looked at me again, and for the first time since the meeting began, there was no immediate procedural response behind her expression. Only assessment. The system she had relied on to compress conflict into manageable penalties was now expanding that same conflict into operational reality. And in that expansion, something quietly irreversible had already begun. The atmosphere inside the room had stopped feeling like a meeting and started feeling like a system under load. Not in collapse, not in conflict, but in strain. Patricia Holloway remained standing at the front table, her posture still controlled, but now noticeably less absolute. Every sentence she delivered seemed to arrive after a brief internal delay, as if she was no longer speaking from authority but from continuous recalculation. The board members had stopped interrupting entirely. Instead, they were watching her, watching me, and watching the heavy container like it had become a shared reference point for something none of them had fully agreed to understand yet. I stayed seated in the same position, hands relaxed, observing without urgency. That was no longer interpreted as passivity. It was beginning to register as stability. Patricia finally broke the silence again, stating that the association would initiate a formal processing review with external accounting support to determine compliance with physical currency intake procedures. The words were carefully chosen, but they no longer functioned as commands. They functioned as acknowledgments of complexity. Someone near the back quietly asked how long such a review would take. No one answered immediately. That absence of answer did more than any statement could have. I noticed Patricia glance toward her phone for the first time since the meeting began, then stop herself before interacting with it, as if realizing that escalation was no longer something she could accelerate. It had already moved beyond her control threshold. The box remained on the table, now slightly shifted, as if it had been touched and then reconsidered multiple times. The pennies inside were not visible individually anymore, but their presence was implied through weight, through silence, through the collective understanding that nothing about this could be resolved quickly. One of the board members finally spoke, suggesting that future enforcement communications might need to include explicit formatting guidelines for acceptable settlement forms to prevent similar operational disruptions. The phrasing was careful, almost diplomatic, but it revealed the shift. They were no longer discussing violation enforcement. They were discussing system redesign. Patricia nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the suggestion without committing to it, which in itself was a change. I could see the structure of authority in the room reorganizing in real time, not through conflict, but through adaptation. The same mechanisms that had been used to apply pressure were now being redirected toward absorbing it. The air conditioning hummed steadily above us, but the room felt warmer, as if the density of attention had increased. Patricia finally stepped slightly away from the table, consulting with the secretary in a lower voice, discussing logging procedures and reconciliation timing. The words were quieter now, no longer projected outward, but contained within administrative necessity. That distinction mattered more than anything else happening in the room. I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing the silence to continue without interruption. Because silence, when it is no longer imposed and instead sustained by uncertainty, begins to function as evidence. Not of resistance, but of transition. The board members were no longer aligned under her framing. They were aligned under process. And process, once activated at this scale, does not move quickly. It expands, it verifies, it records. Patricia returned to the table and announced that the matter would remain open pending financial validation, at which point she paused again, briefly, before adding that enforcement timelines would be temporarily adjusted based on administrative review requirements. It was the first time she had modified her own enforcement language mid-session. No one commented on it, but everyone noticed. I watched her sit down for the first time since the meeting began, placing her hands on the table beside the box instead of above it. The gesture was subtle, but it marked a change in position that no policy could reverse immediately. Around the room, people began gathering their notes more slowly, not because the meeting was ending, but because its outcome had shifted from resolution to continuation. And in that continuation, the structure they relied on was no longer being enforced. It was being examined. The moment Patricia Holloway finished speaking, the room did not return to normal. It settled into something more complicated, something less confident. The meeting that had once been structured around enforcement had now become structured around uncertainty, and uncertainty changes how people occupy space. Chairs were no longer being pushed back decisively. Papers were not being gathered with clarity. Everything moved slightly slower, as if every action required a second internal confirmation. Patricia remained seated at the front table, her hands resting near the box but no longer interacting with it. The presence of it had shifted from object to anchor, something that defined the entire room's attention without needing to move. I stayed where I was, watching the subtle recalibration of authority unfold. Patricia finally spoke again, stating that pending financial validation, no further enforcement action would be initiated at this time. The sentence was carefully constructed, designed to preserve control while acknowledging delay, but it carried a different weight now. It was no longer a directive. It was a pause. One of the board members asked quietly what that meant for the current violation status. Patricia hesitated for half a second before responding that status remained under administrative review, and that no lien filing would proceed until resolution of processing compliance. The word "until" hung in the air longer than anything else she said. It implied limitation. It implied uncertainty. It implied that the system could no longer guarantee immediate consequence. I noticed her glance briefly toward the secretary, then toward the financial binder again, as if searching for a procedural path that had not yet been closed off. But everything she reached for now required time. And time was no longer on the side of acceleration. The container remained untouched for several seconds. Then Patricia finally reached forward and closed the lid fully, not as an act of dismissal, but as an act of containment. It was a small movement, but it changed the tone of the room again. Containment is what systems do when they can no longer resolve something immediately. A board member suggested that a formal policy amendment might be necessary to prevent future payment irregularities of similar nature. Another added that legal counsel might need to be consulted regarding physical tender acceptance thresholds. Each suggestion moved further away from enforcement and closer to restructuring. I could see Patricia listening, but no longer directing. That distinction was now visible in everything she did. The confidence that had defined her earlier presence had not disappeared, but it had redistributed itself across procedure. She was no longer the center of decision-making. She was the manager of its delay. I remained still, observing how quickly authority can transition when it is forced to process something it did not anticipate. There was no confrontation, no argument, no escalation. Only recalibration. The room itself seemed to recognize that the original objective of the meeting had dissolved into something broader and less controllable. Papers were being reviewed again, not for content, but for implication. Phones were checked quietly, then placed face down again. Even breathing seemed more measured, as if everyone understood that nothing useful would come from rushing. Patricia finally stood again, this time with less certainty in the motion. She announced that the meeting would be adjourned pending administrative review outcomes and that all parties would receive formal updates once processing protocols had been completed. No one objected. No one confirmed. The absence of response was its own conclusion. As people began to stand and gather their belongings, the box remained on the table, now officially categorized but not resolved. I watched Patricia look at it one last time before turning away, not with frustration, but with recognition that it could not be removed from the system she had built without first being processed by it. I left my seat only after most of the room had already begun to disperse. The hallway outside was quieter, the transition from structured tension to ordinary silence almost disorienting. But behind me, I knew the meeting had not truly ended. It had simply entered a phase that no longer responded to immediate control. And that phase would continue long after the doors were closed. I walked out of the community hall into the cool evening air, and for the first time since the meeting began, the silence around me felt different. It was no longer the silence of tension or observation. It was the silence that follows a system trying to catch up with itself. Behind the glass doors, I could still see movement, shadows of board members dispersing, Patricia Holloway speaking briefly with the secretary, her gestures smaller now, more contained. The box was no longer visible from where I stood, but I knew exactly where it was, and more importantly, I knew what it had become. Not a payment, not a violation, not even a dispute. It had become a process that could not be reversed without being completed. I stepped down the walkway, the pavement still warm from the day, and noticed how quiet Willowbrook Estates felt when authority was no longer projecting outward. The sprinklers were still running in synchronized arcs across the lawns, but even they seemed less confident, like background systems continuing without instruction. My phone buzzed once as I reached my car. A notification from the HOA portal confirmed what I already expected. The matter remained under administrative review. No further enforcement action pending verification of processing compliance. The language was careful, neutral, almost artificial in its attempt to preserve control. But beneath it, something else was visible. Delay had replaced certainty. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine, watching the reflection of streetlights on the windshield, and I thought about how quickly authority changes when it is forced to operate at a scale it did not design itself for. Inside the system they had built, speed had always been the weapon. Pressure. Deadlines. Escalation. But none of those tools functioned when every response required manual verification. By the time I drove out of Willowbrook Estates, the community hall lights were still on. I could see silhouettes moving inside, continuing discussion, continuing adjustment, continuing the slow process of absorbing what had happened. There would be reports written, procedures reviewed, possibly even amendments proposed. But none of it would return the system to its original state. Because something fundamental had already shifted. Not through conflict, not through confrontation, but through exposure to something it could not compress. $50 had never been the point. It had only been the entry condition. The real structure beneath it was now visible to everyone involved, even if they did not yet want to name it. As I drove past the entrance gate of the neighborhood, I noticed the security camera above it tracking slowly. Automatically, without judgment. Everything in Willowbrook Estates still functioned. The gates still closed. The lights still turned on at scheduled intervals. The rules still existed in printed binders and digital portals. But the confidence behind them had changed. It had been replaced by process awareness. And once a system begins to observe itself that closely, it stops behaving like authority and starts behaving like procedure. I merged onto the main road, leaving the neighborhood behind in the rearview mirror. The evening traffic was ordinary, steady, indifferent, the kind of normalcy that exists outside controlled environments. I kept driving for a few miles without thinking about the meeting, letting the distance turn it into something smaller, not because it had become insignificant, but because it had already completed its transformation. What began as a simple fee had expanded into something else entirely inside their own structure. And the final outcome was not decided by force or argument. It was decided by the moment they realized the system could no longer move without accounting for itself.